to another More to Life webinar. I'm Julie Soskin, Principal of Insight and Intuition, and this evening's title is Life After Death. In a moment, I will introduce our panelists. They will all speak, and then there will be time for some questions from our audience. Do feel free to put comments and questions into the chat. Unusually in these webinars today, our panelists live or have lived near me in France, and I've known them all for many years, so I'm quite sure you'll enjoy their talks today. So we have Marcus Williamson, a British writer, journalist and campaigner. As an obituarist for The Independent, he has written on many hundreds of subjects, including for artists, poets, musicians, actors and inventors. Vanilla Beer, M.A. and B.A., Fellow of the Cybernetics Society and a Fellow of the RSA. She holds various art diplomas and awards, plus a B.A. in Theological Studies and an M.A. in Western Esotericism. I probably pronounced that wrong. I do apologize. Thank you. Finally, we have James McDonald. He's a polymath, mathematician, etymologist, historian, theologian, and prolific writer on a wide range of non-fiction subjects. He holds 2 M.A.s and an M.Sc, and is a Fellow of the Royal Geographical Society. Among his many books is Beyond Belief, A History of Christianity. This is a tome that took many years of travel and research, and I personally can recommend it. So there are our panelists today, and again, a very warm welcome to you all. And I will pass forthwith over to Marcus Williamson. Hello, Marcus.
Hello, Julie, and thank you for your introduction. Can everybody see these slides?
Yes.
Okay, and if I go forwards, does it change?
Yes.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, good. So we're talking this evening about life after death. My interest is in this as an obituarist. So I write biographical pieces just after somebody has died. My pieces usually don't talk about the moment of death itself. They may talk about the cause of death, and they will usually talk about who's confirmed their death, because it's important to know the fact that if somebody has died, whether or not that's true. And we'll be coming on to that in a moment in terms of definitions of what we mean by death and what we mean by life. I've been writing these pieces for the last 25 years or so, and what I find common to all of them is that, as I say, they're really about the person's life, how the person has evolved, and usually there's something in a person's life which turns that life around, which makes that person into who they are and what they are. And again, we'll come into that a little bit later on. Let's look at some definitions, and these are going to be important to the subsequent speakers as well. Is death merely an absence of life? And is life an absence of death? If we talk to biologists, a biologist would say that there are many possible definitions. If we turn to, for example, Lyle Watson, this book, which came out in the 1980s, he would tell us, we can see here, if you ask most biologists to define death, you'll learn that it's an absence of life. Well, maybe that's the case. But if you ask for a definition of life, you get almost as many answers as there are practicing biologists. Despite the fact that life arose from non-living matter, very few of the descriptions will be framed in the negative terms that are applied to death, which is strange because in the cosmos, death is the state of equilibrium, the natural condition to which all life tends if nothing from outside is added to maintain it in action. So there we have one definition of death as a normal state without anything to provide an input from the outside. If we look at the properties of life, some of you may remember this from your biology classes at school, we have the wonderful acronym MERING, and each living being, each living plant, each living animal exhibits these properties of movement, excretion, respiration, reproduction, irritability, that's to say responding to the environment, nutrition, that's some form of feeding, and growth. And if life has those properties, then what does death have? We can return back to Lyle Watson, and we can see a few pages later that our entire life depends on death outside. Because, for example, our skin, he says, life depends on death. We owe our lives not only to the cells that erect a barrier between us and the outside world, that's to say our skin and our hair, but also to armies of others that regularly lay down their lives in internal battles dedicated to the greater glory of the organism. And so our very life is depending on death. The title of his book comes from this paradox which takes place in the Shakespeare play Romeo and Juliet. We probably all know this already. Romeo comes across to find Juliet. She's apparently dead. Romeo takes poison and dies. He doesn't want to be without her. Yet immediately afterwards, Juliet wakes up. She hasn't died. She merely took a sleeping draught. And then, as a result of that, she ends up killing herself with a dagger. Now, that kind of paradox has occurred many times since and continues to occur in modern medicine. You'll have heard of stories of people waking up in the coffin, waking up on the mortuary slab. All of these instances, an example of that Romeo error. And the error comes from the inability to determine the difference between life and death. Somebody has made an error at some point to describe that person as dead, and yet they're not. If we look at death and life in some examples from literature, we can see here, for example, in the well-known Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. This is a translation by Edward Fitzgerald, done in the Victorian times in the 19th century. This quatrain here, we can see very much as evidence of life in practice. What have we got here? We've got a jug of wine, we have bread, so we have food, we're feeding the being, we have singing, and we have the very definition of pleasure and enjoyment and happiness underneath the bough. So a book of verses underneath the bough, a jug of wine, a loaf of bread, and thou, beside me singing in the wilderness, O wilderness were paradise enow. That's life. How about this as another quatrain, as a contrast? Ah, make the most of what ye yet may spend before we too into dust descend. Dust into dust and under dust to lie, sans wine, sans song, sans singer, and sans end. So here Khayyam is showing us the opposite. He's showing us the end, and that for him, what is to come is dust at the end. So if we're to ask the question from his point of view, life after death, not in his case. One of the subjects I wrote about in 2015 was a medium. His name's Colin Fry. You may have come across his name in the papers or on television or on radio. Most subjects that I've written about haven't reflected on their own death. But for him, of course, this was an important aspect, because for him, as a medium, he wanted to know that there was something to come after. He said that there's no problem with putting this body aside. There's no problem with putting aside this mortal shell. But he would then have problems if he thought he was going to lose his personality, his character, his essence of his self. And he said, it's what we think and how we feel, that's who we are, and that's the real us. So for Colin Fry, he would be thinking in terms of some form of afterlife, whereby he might be able to be in contact with those who he loved and who knew him within life. Again, turning to Shakespeare, we see in Hamlet, death is the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveller returns. And if we look at it in the context of the piece, there's this phrase, the mortal coil, which many of us use day to day, come from Hamlet. And in the context here, Hamlet is considering suicide. We can see here that in the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveller returns puzzles the will and makes us rather bear those ills that we have than fly to others that we know not of. The idea being that we'd rather stay within this life that we know well and that we understand than travel to this undiscovered country. And as far as we know, no one has returned from there. Julie mentioned the Ord and France. Here's a sign which appears above the church at Rennes-le-Château in the Ord. And we can see the inscription there in Latin, memento homo, etc. And basically the translation, remember, you are dust, and to dust you shall return. This is within the context of a cemetery, within the grounds of a Christian church. So again, the message coming that we arrive from dust and that we return to dust. So what about the after, and what about what we might leave behind? Well, again, if we turn to literature, something like Wordsworth's Splendour in the Grass, this comes from Intimations of Immortality. And here, what we're seeing is that rather than grieving, the suggestion is that we find strength in what remains behind. And what is it that remains behind? Well, it's those things that we've created during our lives, those things that we've changed, those things that we've made, whether it's another human being, whether it's a literary work, whether it's a work of art. We have, somewhere along the line, we've made a difference. And I think another one of the speakers will be touching on this a little bit more later. So, and thinking then in terms of my own reflections on what comes after, well, I would say that it would be in terms of the dash. You'll have seen in the presentation here a number of people's names with dates of birth and dates of death and a dash between. You may have come across this before, but my own reflection would be that what's important is what you're doing with that dash, what you're doing with your life between the date of the birth and the date of the death. If you're interested in this subject more generally, I can recommend what are now called death cafes. You may have come across them before. These were created by a man called John Underwood, whom I wrote about in 2017. And he created these as a space for people to confront their own mortality, as a way to get together with people over tea or coffee, with cake, to enjoy the fact that we're alive, but also to think about what comes next, and to think about those who've already gone from this world to whatever that next world might be. So remember the dash. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus. I do have one question before we go on, if I can intercept this. You've given us some lovely quotes from people that we're familiar with. I wonder if you feel the same way. So dust to dust. Is that your own feeling?
Yes, I mean, my own reflection from a scientific point of view would be that we are animals. We're part of nature. We've evolved to be what we are. But that when we die, we become that dust again. And for me, what we leave behind, as I say, is our creations, whether that's in terms of other human beings or in terms of what we've made through our work. So yes, for me, it's very much dust to dust, and I'll be interested to see what the other contributors are thinking in those terms as well.
Well, it might be interesting to get different definitions of dust. What
yes,
is that?
absolutely, absolutely, yes.
Okay, thanks ever so much, Marcus, for that. I'm now going to move to Vanilla. Vanilla, hello.
Hello.
Not far from me, only a few miles away, but welcome and lovely to have you back. So what are your thoughts on this, my love?
Well, curiously, Julie, I have to begin by thanking you because you set me on a journey. We all consider death, do we not? But not very systematically. We think about it as and when, and the bits and pieces that we think about occur to us from time to time. But because of Julie's challenge, what happens to us after we die, I thought I would do some thinking, some serious thinking. And so I set about it. And I thank you, Julia, because it's been, for me, extraordinarily interesting. I hope I'm not going to bore you people, because I'm going to take you on the trip I went on to reach the conclusions I have reached. I began by thinking, why have we got a knowledge of death? And I realized that this is specifically human. This belongs almost as a function of our consciousness. To be human knows that you will die. Animals know when they're dying, we know, because they curl up in corners and die, but they don't carry, as far as we know, they don't carry this knowledge with them throughout their days. So we become identifiably human when we have a knowledge of death. So that was where my thinking began. And then I remembered, of course, most of you will have seen the film Blade Runner, which comes from Philip K. Dick's masterpiece, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? And in the course of this, we have our sweet androids who are in love with each other, but programmed to die after, I think, 4 years. And they know this. Love has made them aware that they must die. And they're trying to extend their lives. That's the story. But they are androids, and they have been given a knowledge of death, which is an interesting point. And then I thought about the Garden of Eden, of course. People, our forefathers, let's call them Adam and Eve, living in a state of innocence and happiness and unconsciousness until they hit the tree of knowledge and are excluded and are introduced to the possibility of death. So thinking about consciousness and death led me, of course, to Julian Jaynes, who wrote an extraordinary book called On the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. Actually, the title's much longer, but that's the short version. And in this, Jaynes proposes that we had a completely different mindset, like the innocence of Adam and Eve, perhaps, but that at one point in our species development, we developed modern consciousness, and that this consciousness lost us the knowledge of gods, but gave us the knowledge of death, if one can say that. So Jaynes was in fact a professor of literature, I think, at Harvard or Princeton, somewhere American, but, you know, quality American. And he wrote this extraordinary book claiming that our actual physical brains ceased being bicameral. They stopped being in two separate chunks. One chunk used to talk to the gods and the other chunk used to reply. And according to Jaynes, a bridge was made between these two at some point for some unspecified reason that stopped that dialogue. So we stopped walking with gods, we stopped talking to the clouds, whatever, and became who we are. Now, Jaynes, the reason he said this is because between the Iliad and the Odyssey, and there are other examples, but this is the convenient one to use. Between the Iliad and the Odyssey, people stopped talking to gods and have another kind of consciousness. And so I thought, well, if he's right, and the jury's out on it, of course, we can identify the awareness of our knowledge of death from between 750 BCE and 720 BCE, which is not bad, really. So in the Iliad, which is traditionally the first book, death is the end. There's a blackness in the underworld. It's comfortless and it's senseless. It's quite descriptive in the Iliad, which is notably a lot about death. And in the Odyssey, which is the next book, we think, Odysseus actually summons dead people. He gives them sheep's blood. They come out to drink that. He's gone to a specific place, offered them sheep's blood, and out they come. And he meets some characters, including his own mother. And they all ask for news of their families. They're not in contact with the living, but they want to know about them. They're still agitating for news of the living. And so it seemed to me we start telling stories about death because we have this capacity, we have this consciousness. So my next question is why? Why? What's the biological advantage to us of carrying a knowledge of death? We still kill each other, which seems extraordinary to me. Even if I don't physically strangle you, I'm buying products that give money to companies who buy weapons to commit genocide. Oy. If I don't kill myself, I can smoke cigarettes knowing that they're fatal. Why do people do that? So animals know when they are dying. We know that we will die. So I started worrying about other things, pre-death experiences. Now, pre-death, before you're about to die, there are measurable or at least observable experiences. I began thinking about my Auntie Kitty, who was sitting with her sister, my grandmama, and as she lay dying, she suddenly reached out to the corner of the room. And Grandma said, oh, it was absolutely clear she was reaching out to our parents. And I thought, how sweet, you know. I thought Grandma was lying to me to make my own death easy. But then I discovered that this is quite a common phenomenon. Nurses are particularly clear about this observable phenomenon. So that's a pre-death experience. I'm sure there are others. I'm being brief. The during death experiences. Now, again, we rely on professionals. I don't know about you people, but I haven't been at any actual deaths of a human, I don't think. No, I'd remember. But a girlfriend of mine had her child on a life support machine. The child was 4 years old and was dying. And it was decided to turn off the machine. And the mother watched a great shaft of light come out from the child's stomach. And it was so clear, she assumed everyone else had seen it and was perfectly delighted that all was well with her baby. Nobody else saw it, everyone else was gutted, and she had to go round and soothe everybody. So that's a nice during death experience. And then, of course, the post-death. Oh my God, where are you all? Anybody there?
Yes.
I think I've pressed the wrong button again.
You're still here.
You can still hear me. I can't actually see anything, and I've lost my notes.
We can still hear you, Vanilla.
Okay, well, I'll ramble on without the vision, if you don't mind. So my friend who lost her baby, and then the post-death visits. I think you will all recognize this when a close family member dies, or sometimes suddenly you recognize that someone you know has died, or you dream about your dead friend or family. There's a very strong accessibility with the person who has died. Now, I think these things are kind of normal. But then I thought, well, why should our embodied being, which is how I like to think of ourselves, how should our embodied being take something that is inside us or outside of us and care for us in this way? It makes the whole death process more emotionally comfortable. And I can't work out the function of that, biologically speaking. Anyway, I decided to press on with the attention to philosophers and looked at Deleuze, French philosopher, 1925 to 1995. And he says the great activity is unconscious, which is interesting. You know, where does that fit in with my ideas about living and death? From him, I had to go to Schopenhauer, 1788 to 1860. Schopenhauer is known as the pessimist of death. He said that will exists in the consciousness of all beings, and the term will is debatable, but basically will is the, I don't know, the force of your being. So he says, firstly, man alone carries the certainty of his own death, which was what I was contending. He says, therefore, it's irrational to fear death. And he says, given that we carry the certainty of our own death, and given that it's irrational to fear it, why do immediate goals and desires continue? Good point. Why are we bothered? And he says, we know we are a part of the big nature. Now, the interesting thing about Schopenhauer, and the reason I was drawn to him, is because he did 2 books, basically, well, other stuff, but 2 big books. And between them, he got hold of the Upanishads and started quoting the Vedas. So he was exposed to Hindu philosophy, unlike most of the Western philosophers. In fact, probably all of the Western philosophers. So he concludes that you contain the whole universe, and the whole universe is you. Big one, very subtle, very nice. However, he says when you die, this veil of Maya disappears, it's drawn back, and you become one with the universe. And unfortunately, the universe is endless suffering, torturing, and pain. So for all you don't die, you probably wish you could. He's not much of a laugh, really. Anyway, from him, I stumbled across Nick Bostrom, who's alive. Although the Future of Humanity Institute, which he founded, has been closed quite a couple of weeks ago. This was a multidisciplinary research centre in Oxford, part of a philosophy department, quite an exciting idea, but it turns out there were a few problems and he's been closed down. And he suggested a couple of years ago that we may be living in a computer simulation. He says, in time, humans will make computer simulations that are indistinguishable from the real thing. And that maybe we already have. That's a charming notion, don't you think? And then, of course, I remembered Swedenborg. So 1688 to 1772, 100 years before Schopenhauer. Swedenborg says much more comfortably that every man was created to live to eternity. Every man was created in a state of blessedness. Every man's created to come to heaven. Divine love wills this and provides for this. So that addresses my last question about why do we struggle on with all this? Divine love wills it and provides for this. So then, again by luck, I stumbled across a poem written on a wall in around 1465, maybe a bit later, which says, live, don't know how long, and die, don't know when, must go, don't know where. I am astonished, I am so cheerful. So that was written actually, but it's great, isn't it? That was written by the Emperor Maximilian I, written on the wall of a castle in Schloss Transberg.
So can I just intercede here?
Yes.
Vanilla. As you were talking, I was thinking and hearing from Marcus as well, and you're both quoting from people in history, writers, and so on. And I was thinking about Freud, what Freud said about how people connect with God. And he said that people connect with God with whatever relationship they had with their fathers.
Oh, really? Oh, that's interesting.
Yes. And
Sorry, I think I can get you up again. Yes, there we are.
And
Sorry.
I think maybe from what I'm hearing through the literature of you guys is that the people that have written it are relating to death in whatever their relationship is with life. That's what has come to me in your words. Do you want to just round us up here?
Yes, I've just got a little more to say. I'm nearly out of here. Am I terribly over time? I do talk, don't I? So the next thing that I stumbled over, which I should have done first probably, is Google life after death. And that's glorious. It's all of them say, we know nothing, but I know for a fact they talk about a universe of loving intelligence. They talk about it being serene and loving. They talk about experiences concluding with, it's not your time, and so on. I'll spare you all my selection. Nature is clearly comforting us, and I don't know why. So then I found Richard Jones, his wonderful book, heartily recommended, Philosophy of Mysticism. And he postulates the principle of credulity, in which he says, accept the experience's claims until it can be shown that the experiences are based on some unknowable mechanism or overridden by other considerations that defeat the claim. He says, do we have innate capacities that generate such beliefs? Then it is rational to accept them. So I thought, good-o, let's accept that. He further says, the skeptic's unanswerable demands for certainty can simply be ignored. So I was jolly pleased with this resolution until I had a dream, and I dreamt a shark. And most of you, I think, will remember Damien Hirst's 1991 a sculpture of a shark in a large tank of formaldehyde. And the full title, the full name of this shark, of the work of art, is The Physical Impossibility of Death in the Mind of Someone Living. So we have to really, I mean, assuming that we all have experience of our dead and we carry that with us and they live on, what happens in eternity? When we die, that gets lost. So I've got to start looking into eternity now.
Well, or does it? That's a big question, Vanilla. Well, thank you for that. I mean, quite interesting. A couple of you have mentioned near-death experiences, and at some time in the near future, we will have a webinar on near-death experiences, and there are many and varied. And
they are, aren't they?
So we can talk about that particular thing perhaps at a later date. But bless you for that, Vanilla. So I'm now going to go to James. Welcome, James. Also not very far away from me in France. The floor is yours, my love. Oh, you're muted.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so I've got 3 different sets of ideas about the afterlife, not necessarily related. And in fact, the only reason I've chosen these is because they're interesting for one reason or another, either philosophically or historically. And the first one, which is probably the most controversial, is simply this. It's the idea that there is no afterlife. There is no afterlife because there's nothing like a soul, anything remotely like a soul. This is essentially a materialist view, might be called a monist view, secular view, atheist view, doesn't really matter what you call it. And it's part of generally, not always, it's not necessarily, but it's generally part of a larger scheme of understanding, which rejects anything supernatural. According to this belief system, there simply is nothing supernatural. There are no souls, there are no angels, there are no gods, there are no fairies, there are no mermaids, there are no unicorns. They all belong to the same category of things. They are imaginary. That opens up questions as to why there are so many people who would believe imaginary things. And I have no intention of covering that now, or although I imagine there might be some questions about that. Incidentally, Freud's opinion about gods is that they were childish fantasies, I think he called them. So he belonged to this school of the materialist outlook. It is actually quite old. Certainly it existed in a very small part of the Hindu tradition, and it certainly existed in the Greek tradition. One of the reasons that the idea of atoms was so disliked by the Christian church was that it was so old, and it was put forward by a school of philosophers in Greece who taught that there were only material things. In other words, there were no souls, no spirits, no ghosts, none of that stuff. There were only atoms. And that is pretty much what I would say most scientists believe today. This opinion, this set of beliefs, is actually very much a minority position in the general public and certainly around the world. But in some establishments, it's probably the majority view, I would say, anecdotally. Again, with that as a possibility, there is no afterlife. It doesn't exist. It's no more than a fantasy. And maybe we'll come on to some justifications of why anybody would hold to that. But I'll move on to a second belief system, which is interesting for a completely different reason. And I'll outline the system, and you can see if you can work out what I'm talking about. According to this system, when we die, some immaterial part of us survives. It goes on a journey to a hall with a presiding deity who will conduct a kind of trial. Let's call it a soul, a trial of this soul. And it will be conducted in a rather odd way. The soul will be weighed. And depending on the outcome of the weighing, there are two possibilities as to what might happen to it subsequently. One possibility, the one that you would rather hope for if it were you, is that it will be led off essentially to paradise. And it will be restored, it will be given back a body, and it will live forever in a sort of paradise, along with others in the same position and with the deity. That's if the balance works out well. Incidentally, the balancing is supposed to somehow represent your life on Earth, so that if you have obeyed the religion and if you have behaved well and been just, then that will be revealed by the balancing. If the balance tips the wrong way, then you will be led off into a mighty pair of jaws to be consumed and destroyed forever. Your soul will be destroyed. Okay, I won't do a poll of who thinks they know what this religion might be. It could easily be Christianity. It could easily be early Christianity. But what I was describing was essentially the Egyptian understanding of death and afterlife. And of course, the Egyptian system existed well before Christianity. So there must be a slight suspicion that, I mean, the parallels are so close, and actually there are more. There are other parallels in quite fine detail. There must be a suspicion that the Christians simply picked it up from the Egyptians. Now, that wouldn't be a huge surprise in the sense that Christianity is a syncretic religion. In other words, pretty much everything in it, very nearly everything in Christianity, is simply borrowed from another religion. And by far the biggest contributors, of course, are Judaism and the Greek systems of religion. Somebody once described Christianity as Judaism wonderfully interlarded with Greek religions. And this little element coming from the Egyptians is interesting because there is so little taken from the Egyptians. If you think of it as Christianity as a jigsaw puzzle assembled from other puzzles, they're nearly all Jewish or Greek, with this very notable exception. They've simply taken Egyptian belief and incorporated it into Christianity. I'll just mention one of the tiny little details that is really, I find, quite telling, which is that the Egyptian dead would be provided with food for their journey to the afterlife, because they imagined that the soul would go on a journey. In the Catholic version of Christianity, in the Middle Ages, they developed what we call the last rites. And an element in the last rites is giving the person about to die some substance, viaticum they call it, to sustain them on the journey that they are about to undertake. It's just astonishing detail. And I mean, it's a very odd thing to believe. It's certainly a very odd thing for any materialist to believe. So I will leave that as of historical interest, that it is just extraordinary that that element, and pretty much that element alone, I can think of a few other much more minor examples, just simply got lifted wholesale and incorporated into Christianity. Now that brings me on to a third belief system, which is interesting for different reasons, and it's the beliefs of the Cathars. Now, Cathars, you may know, were a Christian group who flourished in the 13th century, 12th and 13th centuries, and who were wiped out in the course of a crusade followed by an inquisition. So those beliefs disappeared from the face of the earth. But we know quite a bit about what they believed. And in particular, we know about their ideas of an afterlife. And it was simply this. I can see I'm running out of time, so I'll state this very briefly. According to the Cathars, there are only two kinds of people on earth. There are baptized Cathars, and there's everybody else. They might believe or not. They might not even know about Catharism. They might know a lot about it. Doesn't matter. There is only one distinction. There's a group of people who are baptized as Cathars and everybody else. If you belong to the group of everybody else, then when you die, Your soul is released from your body, but it is invariably captured by the evil principle in the universe and re-imprisoned in another body. And in practice, that means in a fetus. Not necessarily human, any warm-blooded creature will do. The soul is imprisoned, it will live another life, all being well, it will be born, live another life, die again, soul will be released again, it will be imprisoned again in another fetus. In other words, it will live a series of lives. So reincarnation, or actually technically metempsychosis, because it could be human or animal. Or transmigration of souls is another name for it. So that's what happens if you die unbaptized. If you die baptized as a Cathar, and assuming you have committed no sins, no major sins since your baptism, then it is completely different. Because the evil principle, the flawed principle, has no power over your soul anymore. It is guided by the Holy Spirit and taken to the realm of light, which is where it came from in the first place, and will rejoin the rest of the light. And there's an interesting parallel here with ideas in Buddhist thought and Hindu thought and Schopenhauer. They didn't use this analogy exactly, but it's a little bit like a water droplet being reintroduced to the ocean. It simply becomes a part of a much greater whole. And they would say that it's returning to that. It started off as part of that huge ocean, and it's returned to the ocean. They would think of it in terms of light. They thought of soul as a spark of light, and it's returning to the realm of light. So it just is incorporated. And actually, interestingly, there are parallels in some other Christian sects. It's called deicist, and it's part of Orthodox belief, Orthodox with a capital O, Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, is that you become part of God again. You return to God and become part of God on your death, assuming you go to heaven. I mean, let's say a Catholic would say you go to heaven. The Orthodox would say you become divine. You actually become part of the divinity. That's one of the differences between Catholic and Orthodox theology. Okay, so I've overrun, but I'll be happy to answer any questions anybody might have on any of that.
Well, thank you so much. I know you've got such a wealth of knowledge, James, and we can only touch them. I'm going to have you on again for talking about the Cathars, of which you're an expert. I personally really like the analogy of the ocean and what you've just described. And hopefully we all have a spark of God within us. I don't know for certain, but that's hopefully what we have. And that then goes back to the ocean, and then maybe a drop of that ocean comes back, but it won't be the same one. So it's slightly different from other opinions on reincarnation. And it's interesting going back to what Marcus said when he quoted Colin Fry, because another belief is that, in fact, we may take our personality initially into spirit, but the personality dies very quickly as we go into that ocean. So there's so many different beliefs and thoughts, and I expect everybody's got their own thoughts on this. It's interesting when we talk about beliefs. and talk about experiences. And I'm sure we're going to get some questions here about people's own experiences. You know, I've got a few, but I'm not going to hog the time here. But thank you, all three of you. And I wonder, Paul, if you've got any questions coming up in the chat. Paul is our lovely tech guy who...
Yeah, none at the moment.
Okay, so does anybody want to ask the questions?
Yes.
Can I hold on with you, Vanessa, see if there's any other audience? Does anybody want to share an experience or ask a question to our panelists? Put your hand up, please, if you do. Who's that? Steve.
Hello.
Hi,
Hello
Steve.
there. Yeah, great stuff, great stuff. First thing, what I've learnt is someone quoted, if we are curiosity in our nature, that being curious, that will dissolve our aspect of the fear of death, because we're curious, you know.
Okay.
Because when one's curious, we're not worried. We got our mind thinking about curiosity, about is there an afterlife. So I love that. But I'd like to mention to Marcus, please, have you heard the concept of, here we go, complexity theory? It sounds a bit heavy, it's way out of my league, but what I'm interested about is systems. You know, like we're made up of cells and atoms and everything, and it's the planet is an ecosystem, so it's the systems, and it's also the cosmos. So I was interested about the concept of dust to dust. That's maybe just on a certain level, but something can carry on as if nothing actually gets destroyed. It goes into another system, but it's a theory. I just thought I'd mention that because you mentioned about biology as a system, like our anatomy system.
Yeah.
So anyway, I'll stop there. Thank
Taking the concept, the scientific concept that no energy can be destroyed, I think that's probably at the heart of what you're saying. Do you want to come back on that, Marcus?
Yes, and in fact, if you do look at, Vanilla mentioned this idea of a beam of light coming up from a figure. There have been studies done on what is the weight of the soul, for example. There is a definite loss of weight, which is measurable upon death, but that could be attributed to all kinds of factors, which are not necessarily the soul or whatever it is itself. The idea of systems that Steve was talking about, of course, all the dust that we are has come from distant stars, which have imploded. All of the elements on the earth from which life is made and from which make life possible, everything that's here, we are quite literally stardust. We could not exist without those cataclysms having taken place in remote history and remotely from us, which mean that the atoms of life, including carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur, are here and now and making this life possible. When scientists go to explore other planets, they're constantly looking for water, because the belief is that life is not possible with water. Now, there may be other life forms which are made up, which do not require water, but of course, those basic elements of life, carbon especially, because of its ability to form chains and to form complex molecules, that, as we understand it at the moment, is an absolute essential for life. My wonder is always in looking out from a window, for example, and thinking of all of the remote possibilities that there have been to make a particular moment in time happen and to make life possible, for example, on this planet or on other planets. We're at a particular sweet spot in time here on this planet. It could be in thousands of years' time that when our resources are expired and when the sun gets too close, that we will then move on to other planets. But for the moment, we are at this particularly sweet spot where we are able to communicate with each other. We are able to have religious beliefs if we want to, or if we don't want to. We're able to manipulate nature in ways that were never possible before. And of course, then we have tools like the tool that we're using now to communicate with each other that we wouldn't have had 100 years ago. All of those are steps in evolution, and all of those would have been impossible, for example, without a moon above us, because the moon was what brought the sea back and forward, which meant that eventually life would come onto land. There's a lot more to be said about that, for example. But the idea being that as part of evolution, we eventually were able to evolve consciousness, as James was talking about earlier on, and as Vanilla was talking about earlier on. So that is the sense of wonder, if you like. When I talk about dust to dust, it's not to negate the wonder of life. It's just the fact that this is the one life that we have, and that we should live it as much as we can and as fully as we can.
Well, I certainly concur with that. I'm thinking here as someone who has worked as a medium, not so much these days, but I perhaps should put in my 5 pennies worth here. And I'm actually going to quote, because it came up with one of your talks, I'm going to quote from the one medium that I met in my life who I felt was 100% genuine. And that's a big statement, I know, but I just knew she was honest, she was genuine, there was nothing bad about her. And I went to a lecture once of hers, this many, many years ago. She's not with us anymore. Her name's Ivy Northage. And she was talking about what her perspective was when we die as a medium. And one thing that stuck in my mind so much, and bearing in mind this was before the internet, this is many, many years ago. She said that when we die, that we see a panoramic film of our lives, but not from the sense of what we're feeling, but what other people felt towards us. And through that we can make our own judgment. And the one thing that stuck with me that I always loved, she said, most people, when they go through this process, she said, rather than all the bad and dreadful things they think they've done, most people do good things all the time. And I just, sorry, I've got to put that in. I don't know if it's true or not, but I just love that idea that when we think of this very sort of, I don't know what word it is, religious thing about judgment. And actually, most people do good things every day of their lives, not bad things. So I just add that into the mix. Vanilla, you wanted to say something, my love.
Yes, I have a couple of things I'd like to say. Well, hundreds of things I'd like to say. First, you may not know that in the Gospel of Mark, the Orthodox Gospel of Mark, not one of the weird ones they just dug up, and I'm quoting from memory, Jesus said, I said you are gods and children of the Most High, but you will die like the sons of men. Oh. Not bad, eh? You don't often hear Christians quoting that. The other thing, it's literally in the Gospel of Mark. I can't remember the chapter and verse, but I'll tell you later on tonight.
The Orthodox Church uses that.
Oh, does it? Hallelujah. Yeah. It was when you started talking about orthodoxy, I thought of it. So anyway, the other question for you, Jamesy, who baptizes the Cathars? Can any of them baptize each other?
Excellent question. Almost every question about the Cathars can be answered by reference to the practice of the very earliest Christian church. So the Cathar practice was the same as that of the earliest Christians that we know about, that are recorded anywhere. And that, contrary to what you probably learned at school, is that any baptized Cathar can baptize anyone.
Oh, that's
And
handy.
a consequence of that, if you think about it, is that there would have been, when they existed, there was an unbroken chain of baptism from any living Cathar at the time back through a chain of predecessors, every one of whom was baptized, right back to the events of Pentecost described in the book of Acts.
Wow.
So, and this was a form of what was called apostolic succession. So they became what they were, and it was very significant to be baptized. It was hugely more significant than it is today, both in the early Christian church and for the Cathars. It was a huge undertaking, a huge commitment. And interest. Well, I won't bore you with lots of detail, but one interesting little aside is that in the mainstream church, the one that we now regard as Orthodox / Catholic, they took that apostolic succession principle and tweaked it so that it does not now apply to any baptized Christian. It applies only to bishops. The apostolic succession is through bishops.
Well, right. I've got a question for you, James. Are you baptized?
I'm baptized in the Church of England.
But not by a Cathar.
There are no Cathars. They were exterminated in the Middle Ages.
Oh, that's lovely.
So in fact, again, just incidental, the reason that the Inquisition went out after the baptized Cathars and pretty much ignored everybody else is they knew that if they exterminated all baptized Cathars, there could never be another one.
Right.
Because they had broken the chain. And
So
they did.
So I wonder, because obviously we live in this area and I know that you do a lot with Cathars. I wonder what you feel about people who, I'm sure you've come across many, who believe they are reincarnated Cathars and presumably were baptized in another life. I wonder what your thought is on that.
All right. Well, now here's the interesting thing about that. There are a lot of people who they quite often use the word perfect. They will say that they were a perfect, just means a baptized Cathar.
Right.
That they were burned alive and they have been reincarnated. There are lots of people who will tell you that. Okay.
How do you feel about that?
Well, the way I feel, I take the view of a historian and a scientist.
Yeah.
And a logician, because if you think about it, you remember what I said about the whole scheme of afterlife for the Cathar. Everybody in the world, according to Cathar belief, is reincarnated, with the sole exception of baptized Cathars.
Oh.
They are the only people who do not get reincarnated because they go off to rejoin God.
Right.
So in Cathar belief, it is impossible for a baptized Cathar to be reincarnated. It just doesn't make sense.
Oh.
It just doesn't make sense. So the logical consequence is, well, first of all, there can't be any. And the people who claim to be have not really understood the theology of the religion that they're claiming to belong to.
It's, I mean, this opens up all sorts of thoughts, doesn't it? I mean, you know, tribalism, control, all those sort of things, how people are controlled by other people and so on. And, you know, beliefs, some of you present know, because I do this in my unfoldment class, beliefs are not set in stone. You can choose what you want to believe, you know. So whatever works for you, I guess. Any other questions? We're running into
One quick
time.
thing.
Richard, yes.
It's
Hello.
always it's always intrigued me that the Cathars didn't want to reproduce themselves, and also in some sense they set out to alienate themselves from the Pope by refusing to pay taxes. And then the Bonsegur happened and Béziers. They were a very interesting group for many reasons, as I'm sure James knows, but that's always an intriguing aspect. They didn't seem
Oh, we've lost you.
to want to produce themselves in a physical sense.
Well, okay,
That's
so
it.
there are two parts of this. One is for the baptized Cathars, they were strictly celibate.
Yes.
And did not reproduce. They're a tiny minority of the believers. There are far more believers. The believers lead ordinary family lives, and they do reproduce. So the Cathars were never really in danger of dying out because of their beliefs, like say the Shakers did in the States, because all the Shakers declined to reproduce, so they died out. That was never a. And actually, if you think about it, the Catholic Church is the same. Priests don't reproduce, and yet the Catholic Church increases because everybody else does.
Because there was a time when they reproduced, the Catholic priests.
And there was a time when they were allowed to marry.
Yes.
Well, actually, there are slightly different rules about celibacy and the right to have sex and the right to marry are slightly different things. But you're right. There was a time when that wasn't a problem, and then it became a problem. But the other strand of this is they didn't really do anything to make an enemy of the Catholic Church, papacy. It's simply that their beliefs were so incompatible with Catholic doctrine that pretty much everything they did was regarded as either heretical or blasphemous. And it wasn't just one or two things. It was a good dozen or so beliefs that they held that the Catholic Church regarded as heresy.
With time is running short now. We got any last question? No, well, some people have come in and gone out, but I mean, like all these webinars, it opens a pot for all sorts of other things that we could talk about as we go on. I've already mentioned, hopefully we're going to have one on near-death experiences. I would like the next one, probably in June, to revolve somewhere around healing and what people think of healing and what is healing and so on and so forth. And I'll be sending out that information when I've got it nailed down. I think all of you know me, so I don't need to tell you my website or anything which you know. And if there is no more final words, does anybody want to give us a last word of hope in all of this? Well, maybe I shall finish with that famous comedian years ago, which ages me. And he used to finish his session every time with, "May your God go with you." So I think I'll leave it with that one. And bless you all for coming in, and look forward to the next one.